Welcome to today's edition of our Casework Conversations podcast at the Housing Ombudsman Service. I'm Sana, an apprentice within the Sector Learning and Development team, and I'm joined by Evan Hughes, who is one of our investigators at the Housing Ombudsman. Today, we've got a really interesting ASB case we're going to be talking about that Evan investigated and determined. It's a case where we've got lots of examples of good practice, and I know we get a lot of requests to hear about what good practice looks like. So, along with discussing the good practice examples, we're also going to cover the difference between ASB reports and service complaints, the Housing Ombudsman's role in ASB complaints, and the tools that can help us when the tools that can help you in determining ASB reports. So we've got quite a lot to cover there, Evan. It's really lovely to have you on our podcast today. So that our listeners can get to know you a little better, could you introduce yourself and tell us about your role at the Housing Ombudsman Service?
Yes, good afternoon, Sana. I'm an investigator. I work in dispute resolution at the Housing Ombudsman Service. My role is to investigate the complaints that have been brought to us and then make a decision whether there's been any maladministration or service failure by a landlord. I've worked here now for just over 2 years, and before that, I worked in local authority housing services for about 15 years. I started first as a housing officer and then I specialised in antisocial behaviour. I spent the last 5 years before joining the HOS working in ASB specifically. I managed a town and was responsible for both responding to reports of antisocial behaviour and then organising meetings to address wider community safety issues.
Wow, thank you, Evan. So a lot of housing and ASB experience you've got there. So before we go into the details of the ASB case that we're talking about today, I thought we could cover a common question we often get asked about, which is the difference between an ASB report and ASB service complaints. It's a little bit like the chicken and the egg conundrum in the complaints world. So there can often be difficulties distinguishing between the two. How do you distinguish between a report for ASB and a complaint about ASB handling?
So some of that confusion is because of the vocabulary that is used when dealing with reports of antisocial behaviour. Often the party reporting an incident is known as the complainant, and so the reports are considered complaints about X. This is usually the case, especially on online reporting forms that say something like ASB complaint or complaint about ASB. So if this happens, a resident's complaint about the service sometimes can get lost in the ASB system, especially when they're making a large number of reports. Making it clear that an ASB report form is just that can stop some of this confusion. Also, having staff properly trained to recognise that a resident does not need to say the words complaint about service to have it investigated as such can also help. A resident saying that they are dissatisfied with a service should be logged as a complaint as set out in the code. This will ensure that the complaints are investigated promptly.
Okay, that makes sense. So, in essence, if a resident is letting the landlord know about an instance of ASB that they're experiencing, that's likely to be a report. And where a resident expresses they're not happy with how a landlord's dealing with their reports, that's more likely to be a complaint. So I guess if in doubt, though, that the landlord can always check in with the resident when they make contact, right?
Yeah, of course, definitely.
So let's get into the case that you investigated. Can you tell us what the complaints were and a bit about the resident circumstances?
Of course, yeah. So the complaints in this case were about the landlord's handling of reports of antisocial behaviour. The resident was a single person. He lived alone in a one-bedroom ground floor flat, and he shared a garden with the tenant who lives in the flat above. Between 2021 and 2023, he made some allegations that his neighbour from the flat above threatened and assaulted him. He complained in January 2024 because he felt the landlord had not done enough to resolve those reports of antisocial behaviour.
Right, okay. So you explained earlier the difference between antisocial behaviour reports and ASB complaints. So this matter would have started with ASB reports to the landlord. Can you tell me a bit more about the instances of ASB that the resident had reported to the landlord?
Yep, of course. Yeah, there was a few different incidents that had happened in that period, and they'd all been dealt with as reports to the landlord or complaints, as we say. So he first made allegations about his neighbour that he threatened him in November 2021. After interviewing both parties, the landlord issued a written warning to the neighbour and then closed the case. Things escalated after that case was closed, and in July 2023, the resident made further allegations that his neighbour had assaulted him. Within 5 days of the report, the landlord had taken statements from the resident, other witnesses, and then had been granted a without notice injunction by the court. It was later granted a full injunction with power of arrest.
Wow, so it sounds like the landlord took some swift action after those reports were made in 2022. The ASB issues do sound pretty serious too, with an injunction being granted by the court. So, along with the landlord taking action and there being court involvement, there was some involvement by the police too, wasn't there? Did the police take any further action in relation to the ASB reports?
Yes, after the landlord had served the injunction, there was then a further incident in May 2023, which caused the resident to have to phone the police. The landlord recognised that this could be a breach of an injunction, and so it began the process of a committal application. It took statements from the resident and other witnesses to begin that process. However, before it was able to fully process the application, there was another incident in June 2023 which led to the neighbour's arrest. The police bailed the neighbour away from the property, and then CPS took over the criminal investigation. While the criminal investigation was ongoing, the landlord held back on its committal application. In December 2023, the CPS chose not to pursue the charges against the neighbour, and they were allowed to return to the property.
Right, okay. So the resident was likely to be quite concerned and afraid after the CPS's decision not to pursue action any further. What happened after this? Did the landlord take any action after the police and the CPS stopped pursuing the charges?
Yes, he probably was. Once the landlord knew CPS were no longer pursuing the criminal charges, it then reconsidered its own committal application. It reviewed the application and the evidence that was available in the case, and it consulted with its legal team. They decided that the court would likely consider the 6 month exclusion from the property resulting from those bail conditions. It knew the neighbour was going to seek to defend the proceedings also, if it considered committal application or extending the order. So decided it was going to try and adjourn the hearing to be relisted if there were any further serious incidents involving the neighbour. The court eventually decided to discharge the whole injunction on the 12th of February 2024.
Right, so when the landlord became aware of the CPS no longer pursuing matters, it looked into what steps it could take next by the sounds of things. But the court discharging the injunction must have been really alarming for the resident. So, how did this develop into a complaint by the resident about the landlord? Could you tell me a bit more about when the resident made their complaint about the landlord's handling of these ASB issues?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So he complained in January 2024. So that was before the court had discharged the injunction, because he felt at that point that the landlord hadn't done enough to resolve the antisocial behaviour. The landlord reviewed its own handling of its case and ultimately found that it had followed its processes and it didn't uphold his complaint. In its stage two response, it later found out that the court had discharged the injunction. It highlighted the option for an ASB case review, which was formerly known as the community trigger, and then it directed him to us.
Right, okay. So the resident made a complaint to the landlord, and we're in the position now that the landlord felt that they dealt with matters appropriately.
Yeah.
So this must have then triggered the resident coming to our service, and then this case landing on your desk for investigation. So it's probably a good time for us to just pause and talk about the Housing Ombudsman's jurisdiction when it comes to ASB complaints generally.
Mhm.
So ASB can be quite complex, can't it, and involve lots of different agencies working on the same matter. So we've heard how the police, the CPS, and the landlord have been involved in this case. Our role is quite different to other bodies like the police and the local authority, for example. So when you investigate cases that involve antisocial behaviour issues. What's within our remit to investigate, and how does our role differ to the powers of landlords, local authorities, and the police?
Yes, so our role is obviously very different. In cases about antisocial behaviour, it's not to decide whether or not the antisocial behaviour occurred or who is responsible. We are here to look to see whether or not the landlord has dealt with the reports it received in a timely way and in the time frame of the complaint. This includes looking at the landlord if it has followed its procedures, good practice, and behaved reasonably when accounting for all the circumstances that have been presented. Sometimes a resident may tell us that they want us to have the landlord to evict the perpetrator of the antisocial behaviour or take other specific legal action. It's not within our authority to require a landlord to take legal action or otherwise against its tenants. The landlord, local authority, and police are in the position to decide if the antisocial behaviour has occurred, what the impact is on the resident and the wider community. They have to consider the wider implications of their decisions, such as the demand on public services and whether the actions they take are reasonable and proportionate. These are complex decisions and not always explained well to residents.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it does all sound very complex there. So thanks for clarifying that, Evan. So just so that I'm clear then, so we're not here to establish whether ASB has taken place, and we can't compel a landlord to take legal action. So we're looking at how the landlord dealt with the residents' reports.
Yeah,
So, yep.
yes, definitely. Yeah. Just how it's responded specifically to what the resident has told them has happened. That's what we're going to be investigating.
Brilliant. So let's talk a bit more about your investigation. How did you go about investigating the case? And in terms of the landlord's handling of the reports of ASB, what were your findings?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that we do in all cases is obviously review the records that we get presented from both parties. In this case, the landlord had extensive records of the ASB case, such as the times it's interviewed the resident, interviewed the alleged perpetrator, and some of the actions it's taken. And then we also considered that against what the landlord's antisocial behaviour policy says and what is good practice for the time. In this case, the landlord has a policy that says it will risk assess its cases of antisocial behaviour and enact within a certain time frame. Because this case included some threats of violence, that policy says that it must meet with the complainant within 1 working day. Obviously, cases like this can be challenging because the options available or chosen by a landlord not always what the resident might prefer, and they have to manage those expectations with the resident. I found that the landlord had taken the resident's report seriously and responded accordingly. When he first reported the instance, the landlord triaged its case, allocated it for investigation within 1 working day, and then interviewed the resident, risk assessed his report, and agreed an action plan. It followed this up by contacting the neighbour and then issuing warning letters. All of this is good practice and reflected the seriousness of the allegations. When the things escalated in July 2022, it also acted appropriately. It immediately categorised the incident as urgent, interviewed the resident within 1 working day, and then promptly decided that it was enough evidence to pursue a without notice injunction. This would have given the resident sufficient protection from the neighbour and showed that it was taking these problems seriously. Also, I found that within the landlord's records, it showed that it was keeping good, clear communication with the resident and the other witnesses throughout. It was explaining the processes to them. It was saying what would happen if they did the injunction and what will happen if that gets breached. When the things escalated in the following year, in May 2023, you can see that the landlord, or that we found that the landlord, worked in close partnership with the police and other agencies. It did those additional complainant interviews and risk assessments, and then it sought wider evidence from other witnesses in the area. It recognised how serious the issue was and promptly made referrals to other support agencies to also help with the resident. Once the neighbour was charged by the police, it was a reasonable decision for them to allow the police and the CPS to take the lead. The criminal application that they were pursuing was related to the antisocial behaviour and was then going to be made to a higher court. Also, they'd introduced bail conditions for the neighbour to stay away from the property, which meant additional protection was in place for the resident. While it was waiting for this decision from the CPS, it kept in regular contact, provided case updates to the resident and other witnesses, and it was actively reviewing its own case. This altogether would have been reassuring to both the resident and those other witnesses, and would have helped them to understand that the landlord was actively managing the case. All of this is good practice, and by doing these regular case reviews internally, it stopped the case from getting any kind of drift. They kept proper monitoring of the case and good oversight, which also would have helped the resident to understand what was happening and why. Once the landlord received that decision from the CPS, it promptly reassessed the case also and decided it, because it had low success at court for the breach of the injunction, it looked at other avenues to help protect the resident. It took professional advice to make this decision and then promptly shared those findings with the resident. Although it wasn't necessarily what he wanted to hear, it's clear that they made that decision fairly and promptly. When the ASB injunction was discharged in February 2024, the landlord told the resident that as well. It used the opportunity to highlight the ways that he could report new incidents and explain why the court had made that decision. Its complaint responses at stage 1 and 2 were also very fair. They provided an accurate summary of its actions and then they reflected the work done by its officers. It's good for us to see that they're sharing how they've come to those decisions and why when they're telling the resident in their complaint responses. It was also positive that it explained the ASB case review process, as this would have allowed an independent party to review the landlord's actions in case the resident disputed the effectiveness of those actions. Although we found no maladministration by the landlord, we can see that these circumstances did affect the resident. We don't underestimate the distress this situation could have caused to him. The ASB was serious and did have a significant impact, but the landlord acted appropriately and in line with its processes to help the resident. It assessed his reports effectively, it conducted risk assessments, it had detailed action plans which agreed with him throughout. It regularly reviewed the risk assessments and made referrals for support in response to when those issues changed for the resident. It took prompt action and maintained regular communication with him throughout. These are all good things that we like to see when we're looking at ASB cases.
Brilliant. So there's quite a lot of good examples of how the landlord effectively handled the residents' ASB reports there. But lots for our listeners to kind of take in there. For me, communication really stands out here. So yeah, it actually reminds me of the 40s in communication for complaint handling. And we mentioned this in our April 2025 report on learning from severe maladministration. So just as a recap for any of our listeners that might not have read that report, the 40s in communication for complaint handling are timely, transparent, tailored, and tone. So our listeners probably can't see, but I had to kind of count on my fingers there to make sure I had all four there. So the report suggests that when landlords are dealing with complaints, they are timely, so responding promptly and keeping residents informed at every stage, just like this landlord did here. That they're transparent and clear about processes, decisions, and outcomes, which again, as you've outlined, we can see that here in this case. And also tailored, adapting their communication to the household's needs. And you mentioned earlier that relevant referrals to social services were made when they were needed.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of tone, especially in this case with the nature of the allegations that the resident was making, it was really important for the landlord to use a respectful and empathetic tone, which is also something that's covered within our 40s. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of good practice, and we can see how the landlord is in this case kind of really doing what they need to do to try to resolve these matters.
Yeah.
So with good practice in mind, what would you say are the key takeaways of good practice in this case?
I think there are quite a few, and the first one for me was the real benefits of using an agreed action plan. Sometimes you'll see, or that we will see, landlords will do a risk assessment with a resident and sort of recognize the risks that are possible to them, but then don't follow that up by agreeing an action plan of what they can do, what they will do, and how long that will take. that sets out the tone for the whole investigation in antisocial behaviour. And in this case, it ensured that there was a clear understanding from the start of the investigation what it would do and then the steps it's going to be taking throughout. It does stops any of this kind of drift where residents can find themselves reporting incidents over and over again, or in other cases such as noise complaints and the like, where residents will report, say, 20, 30 incidents in a week, and the landlord obviously has difficulty managing that demand on their service. If they set out from the start an agreed action plan, as they did in this case, they can say, right, this is how long we want you to tell us things. This is by what time we're going to respond to you. And they're setting out that clear expectation both ways at the start. Also, the landlord was really used its initiative when the instance escalated in 2022. It applied for a without notice injunction, and that afforded the residents some important protection when he needed them, and it stopped the ASB for at least 12 months. Injunctions are an important tool that landlords can use that provide protection for their residents and can stop ASB in its tracks. They're an effective alternative to possession proceedings in most cases. Although evictions can sometimes be necessary, that immediate protection that can be afforded through an injunction to stop things in their tracks can allow other services to be involved and then sort of rebalance those behaviours between both residents.
Yeah, so that injunction kind of provides that bit of a pause, doesn't it? And
Yes,
so that landlords can kind of protect the resident in that time and then take any actions in that time as well.
exactly.
Yeah.
They show that they're taking things seriously and
Mm.
recognising what risks there are and how they can manage and prevent those from escalating.
Yeah, it sounds like in this case, the landlord really took ownership of matters and kind of used those available tools to deal with issues here.
Yeah.
So, Evan, I'm really keen to extract as much as I can from you, squeeze every bit out for it in the time that we have in our podcast today. So, from your past experience in antisocial behaviour, are there any useful tools available which you feel might help to get things resolved at a local level, or at least help progress dealing with antisocial behaviour matters that landlords can maybe make use of?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I sometimes worry that officers might shy away from the tools that get available to them through the ASB Crime and Policing Act because there's a lot of admin that can be involved in some of those things. As a former ASB officer myself, I understand that the demands placed on frontline staff can be quite difficult. However, there is support available for landlords across the country. Tools like the ASB case review, which were the community trigger, can allow residents to present their cases to wider partnership agencies that can add direction to how a case can be managed and often lead to positive actions that, when followed, can progress or even resolve some cases. Also, from my own experience, I often see that landlords don't utilise the local community safety partnerships that are available to them. Community safety teams across the country will organise regular partnership discussion meetings where complex cases can be discussed by a broad range of services that usually include local authority, police, and health services. The landlords themselves can attend these meetings for guidance and agree cross-service actions to resolve cases. Matters that are complex in nature, such as cuckooing, modern-day slavery, suspected drug dealing, prostitution, all those sorts of really difficult cases can be resolved through some of these forums. If landlords made better use of those services to manage their complex needs cases, they would be able to better evidence that they are taking matters seriously, show that they're working towards agreed plans to resolve a case, have regular oversight and review of these types of cases, and where partners agree that the evidence is lacking or contrary to those submitted by a resident, they can show that they have given proper consideration when closing a case where a resident has complained about their decision making.
Wow, okay, so that's really interesting, Evan. So the ASB case review, which was previously the community trigger, right?
Yes, that's the one,
Yeah,
yeah.
they sound like a really good tool, actually. And I really like how the different agencies come together in these community safety teams as well. I think that's a top tip there, a little golden nugget that our listeners can take away with them today. So, Evan, I'm sad to say that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for sharing this case with us and kind of covering your top tips as well, which has been really handy at the end. We have covered quite a lot in a short space of time. We've covered good practice examples or jurisdiction, distinguishing between service complaints and ASB reports, and finally, your suggestions in making use of the community trigger, or as I should say, the ASB case review system. I think community trigger is a little bit catchier, but I'll have to stop saying that.
They just like to
Yeah.
confuse us all.
So thank you ever so much. Thank you again, Evan. And thank you to our listeners as well for tuning in. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, we've got plenty more of them available on the SoundCloud platform or through our Centre for Learning Landlord Hub. There are also a whole host of other resources our member landlords on our Learning Hub can make use of, so do check that out. And if you're a resident, we do also have lots of information and resources on our website, www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. So thank you again, Evan, and thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye.